What's going on, Freedom Family? Good morning, good morning, good morning. Oh, got that sun leaning on me this morning, at least not yet. Sometimes it starts out cloudy like this and then the sun breaks through. How is everybody doing? Yes, yes, yes. All right, Jesus. All right, what is going on? We are talking about business today. I haven't had a business conversation with you guys in quite a while. So we're here answering the question that everybody asks, the question that has no answer, right? Um, we probably hear 10 times a week, what's the best business to run in Kenya? What's the best business to run in Africa? Blah, 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 blah. And the answer is always there is no answer to that because it depends on what you know how to do, right? The best business for you is not going to be the best business for the next person, right? Because if you don't know how to do that business, then it doesn't even make sense talking about it. Right? If the number one industry in Kenya is rocket science and you're not a rocket scientist, what does that matter to you? Right? So it's a really bad question overall, quite frankly. It's a question that typically indicates that a very little amount of thought has been, utilized to formulate the question, right? So it's a thoughtless question. Typically, what you got to do is you have to take inventory of whatever it is you know the best. Okay. Now, there are some exercises you can do because typically, whatever you know the best is whatever you see the most, right? So think the last time you bought a new car. You bought that new car and then you saw that new car everywhere. You were driving down the street and everywhere you went, you saw another Ford Taurus or you saw another whatever the car is, right? Another Jeep or another Subaru or whatever, right? Because you bought that car, now you recognized it everywhere, right? So without necessarily identifying, typically people know what they do best, but without actually identifying what you do best, what you see the most is typically related to that. So when you do any kind of feasibility exercise, you're going to see the stuff that you know the best or that you do the most, right? So it's still going to have some validity to you specifically, right? The easiest exercise, that we do in accordance with a client, right? A client that wants to get involved in business and maybe hasn't done that before or has been involved in like solopreneurship, which is really just the act of owning a job. It's not really equivalent to being in business, right? And folks that know that understand they need a little bit of help when they want to make the jump to actual business. And so what ends up happening is the easiest way to engage with that is to invert it, right? So if you want to figure out where you can add the most value, which value in business typically directly translates into help, right? So where you can solve the most problems, where you can help the most people, okay? You typically invert the question, right? Where are the most people being harmed, right? Where are the most people being frustrated? Where are the most problems? Now, if you're not an astrophysicist, you're not going to think that, well, where there are the most problems are entry vectors with the rockets trying to get to the moon. That's not even going to cross your mind, right? So you see how when you go through the exercise, the thing that you know best will present itself, right? Because that's not going to be a problem that crosses your mind unless you're a rocket scientist. And then rocket science is where you should go, right? So the problems that immediately jump into your mind are the things that you actually know best. And that's how you actually can identify them as a problem, right? So it becomes a cognitive exercise that will now go ahead and expose your mentality, the things you know best, the things you do best, and the things you actually have a shot at solving, You see how that works, right? Unfortunately, well, I guess it's not unfortunate because when you look into why it is that way, it's so that we can survive, so that we can live. So, human evolution, I should say, has evolved to make it easier for us to think through negative things than positive things, right? Because in human history, the negative things are what took our lives, right? We remembered when old Charlie went, to the lake and tried to drink some water and a crocodile jumped up and snatched him. We remember that for the rest of our lives because it can save us, right? That's how human brains work and that's how human evolution works, right? So it's way easier for us to think through what can go wrong about with things than it is to think through solutions and what can go right with a thing. So when you're trying to figure out these businesses, when you're asking that question, all right, I'm thinking about moving to whatever country. For us, it's always Kenya, right? But I'm thinking about moving, to Kenya. What kind of business can I create there? You start from the inverse. You start from, all right, what kind of pain points are happening, right? What are people suffering with? What are people frustrated with? And if it's an industry thing, then those industry frustrations will typically be universal, right? How can you make that assumption that the industry, pain points are going to be universal? Well, because if there was a solution somewhere, that solution would proliferate throughout the industry, right? So if there's a solution to a pain point, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Capitalism is going to go find that solution, right? So if there's a pain point in an entire industry and there's a solve for it in Korea, American companies, Canadian companies, British companies are going to go to Korea and get the solve, right? That's just the way it works. So if that pain point is prevalent in industry, not in your literal whatever you're doing, right? But in industry, then there's not a solution to it yet anywhere, right? So you can always assume that industrial pain points are going to be universal and then try to solve for that, right? And then if you solve it, it's going to be adopted by the industry, right? It should be a solve for the industry in general. So if that's where your experience lies, and your experience could lie there as an employee, right? We've had folks that worked for very small outfits, right? Like we had a guy who worked for Dunkin' Donuts and ended up making over $1 million in coffee exports because he understood a little bit of coffee psychology. He understood those regular clients that came in every morning, bought a bag of beans and a black coffee, but then talked about the history of Ethiopia and coffee, right? Talking about people who are on a different level of coffee consumption, what we might consider a coffee snob, right? But he understood that, and that he was able to, when he came to Kenya, make deals with coffee farmers and then make deals with very niche bakeries and coffee shops in the US, people who knew the difference between a Kenyan bean and a Ugandan bean and an Ethiopian bean and a Jamaican bean, so on and so forth. And he was able to get the USXM Bank, huge resource, y'all better write that down, exim.gov, right? USXM Bank. XM stands for Export Import Bank of the United States of America. So he was able to get the XM Bank to help him import coffee beans, the Import and Export Bank, right, to finance the whole thing with no credit. Made $1.2 million off the first deal. He lives a very nice life in a town up the coast called Malindi. Lives on the beach, right? So it's all about working in reverse. If you want to work efficiently, you want to figure things out quickly, and you want those things to be fairly correct, you want to work from the pain points, right? You want to work from the now. The bigger the pain point, the bigger the payoff, right? The bigger the solution to the problem, the more money you're going to make, right? That's just the way it works, right? So folks that have been in business over and over again and they never make any money is because they're not solving big problems. They're solving tiny little problems, and so they make tiny little money. That's just the way it works. Okay, there are some exceptions that prove the rule, typically in the world of luxury, but that's the way it works in general. Right? So if you're not solving a giant problem, do not expect to make giant money. All right. So a lot of times when people are working through that exercise, they imagine the most harm that they can do that's available. That's actually happening, not sci-fi harm, right? Not aliens invading the planet. You know what I mean? But all right, what is the biggest problem? What's the most harm that's happening right now? You know, in this environment or in this jurisprudence. And now, how do you prevent that harm from happening? Right? Then you inverse it. How do you now prevent that harm from taking place? All right, harm that's already taking place. That's a big problem. And then the solution to that big problem is going to come with big value, right? And then we convert that value into money. That's the way that the cycle works. All right, so that's the actual answer to the lazy question that people ask. What are the best businesses in this country in Africa, in that country in Africa? That's a horrific question, right? The the more appropriate question is for someone to think through on their own so that it applies directly to what they know, because that's all they're going to see. A hammer is only going to see nails. A screwdriver is only going to see screws, right? It's not that their answer is right, it's that their answer is right to them because of their worldview, right? So it's better to invert that question and let them see it through their own lens of, okay, what needs to be fixed the most based on what I know, based on what I do. Now, if there's no industry knowledge, like if that person doesn't actually work in an industry, so their frame of reference is not universal, that's when you hire for a feasibility study. So if you're not working in a universal industry and your frame of reference isn't universal, you can either roll the dice and assume that your frame of reference is either unique enough for it to be adopted on a luxury level or universal enough for everybody to get it, right? Which is a risk and is probably wrong. But when it's right, it goes big, all right? Or you hire in for a feasibility study. You don't have to do everything yourself, and it's probably the worst way to do things, typically. The feasibility study will use a lot of the same, like they'll use inversion. You know, um, they'll try to figure out what the biggest pain points are. They'll try to figure out if you have the skills necessary, to solve for those pain points, right? In certain situations, they'll try to figure out how quickly you learn. Can you learn fast enough to effectively figure out, how to alleviate a pain point, even if you don't have the skill set? We've actually met quite a few people like that are just cognitively, through the roof, and they can figure it out, right? And so that's how you get to the real answer of that question when the question is not being asked lazily. Right. Well, yeah, you're right. Well, sometimes you don't. Like sometimes your skill set isn't in tune with solving some giant problem, right? Sometimes it's just not, and that's fine, right? Not everybody can save the world every single day, right? It'd be a pretty shitty world if that was available, right? If we were in peril to that level where every day somebody had to, uh, save us with some brand new, ground shattering innovation, then it wouldn't be a world that I would want to live in, right? So it's not, that great. And that's really the mother of quite a bit of invention, is when you have those incredibly stressful situations and those incredibly perilous situations. But invention isn't efficiency, right? Surviving something doesn't necessarily have to be efficient. And if it's not efficient, it can create more problems than it solves for. It just so happens that one of the problems it solves for keeps you alive in that moment, right? So that's why we don't see a whole lot of like war tech being turned into, standard civilian tech in the same form. Typically, there are upgrades that need to happen, refinements that need to happen for any of that tech to actually make into, the civilian market and be helpful. Because if it's something that's created on the fly, yeah, it does what it's supposed to do, but there's typically a whole bunch of collateral, nonsense that comes along with it that wouldn't be acceptable in a civilian setting. Right, right. But the thought process is in the right direction. That's for sure. Well, yeah. I mean, it's lazy, right? People want an answer that they can just go open a McDonald's and they'll be a billionaire. That's not the way it works, right? If it worked that way, there'd be no space for you. People would have done it already. It's not. That's not how business works. Thank goodness, right? Or virtually none of us would be in business. BlackRock would own everything, right? So, so the way it works is, what are you good at, and how does that make the lives of everybody else easier, right? Or at least your target, market. No one's, you know, um, no one's target client is everyone except for governments, right? And even then, they disappoint half their citizenry all the time, even though they're supposed to take care of all of them, right? So, it's definitely going to be, your target group, whatever that group might be. And are you providing actual efficiency to them? Are you doing something that's improving their life? Are you doing something that's taking away a pain point or a pressure point? And are you doing it effectively and efficiently? That's essentially what it boils down to. What kind of things have I seen? I've seen a lot of export, a little bit of import, but a lot of export. I've seen a lot of housing solutions. I've seen a lot of short-term rental solutions. Let me think. What else have I seen? I saw one organization that did jewelry. Uh, I met an organization that was doing aquamarine mining in a place called Meru. So they were um, they were extracting the gems. They were finding like the aquamarine veins and extracting the gems. And I don't even think they were cutting them. I think they were sending raw gems out to be cut, by another organization. So those are the kinds of things. Trying to think about what other types of things our clients do. Those are the types of businesses that we've seen from our clients. Um, a lot of our clients use a bond ladder. So the clients that use a bond ladder, they're doing more solopreneur stuff, which is really not the same thing as business in the sense of, the business that we're talking about, right? Can you maybe get business tax deductions and stuff like that? Sure, sure, sure. Right? I'm not like downplaying like you solopreneurs. I was a solopreneur for quite a while. But what I'm saying is, as far as coming, to a place and employing people, obviously solopreneurship does not do that. All right. So that's not really what I'm discussing today, but a lot of our bond people, that's exactly what they become, right? Because they're following some dream that they've always had that centers around them, which is cool. Now you're in a situation where you can center yourself, right? That's what the bond ladder allows for you. So a lot of them get into like voice acting, they do art, they do music, they do like all these things that they always wish they could do, but they had to get a paycheck. Now they don't need the paycheck because the bond ladder is the paycheck, and then they go do those things, right? So a very large percentage of our folks are doing that versus opening companies because companies are risky, companies are hard. It sucks half of the time, and then you have to have a mentality where you see the suckiness of that situation as a good thing, as an indicator that you're moving in the right direction, right? And so you need that kind of discipline and all of that to really make it happen. And so obviously the bond ladder is way easier. Right? The solopreneur kind of hobby craft stuff is way easier, and I ain't knocking nobody for living an easy life, right? However, in this live, what we're doing is we're talking to those people who really do want to create a business that employs, local people wherever they're moving to and actually has a positive impact, right? So while there are other options, what we're discussing in this live today is that particular option. You know what? One of the cool things about inverse strategy, right, is that while you're kind of imagining the worst case scenario and work backwards to avoid it, right? You also gain insights into which organizations are not avoiding it, right? Which organizations are almost fulfilling the worst case scenario, right? And so then you automatically know which organizations you're diametrically opposed to, right? So which organizations are essentially off the list for any kind of joint venture, any kind of partnership, any of that, because you identify immediately the principles of what you're doing and and you can identify which organizations are diametrically opposed to those principles, right? So it lets you know exactly, who the problems are, possibly, who your competition is or who your rival might be, and then you solve for that. But you never want to play someone else's game, right? You want to have your battle strategy. You want to have, your corporate strategy set up and ready to rock, and you don't deviate from that unless the data tells you. Typically, data would also indicate either your client base or the law base, right? So if the laws change, that's data that tells you have to change something. You can't operate illegally. And then if your clients, not all prospects, because not all prospects are your clients. There's going to be a lot of people that tell you what's wrong with what you're doing who are never going to buy it anyway. So who cares what they think, right? They were never going to do business with you anyway, right? They just got a big mouth because social media has given the world a big mouth, right? So people talk about stuff that they have no expertise on all the time now, because of social media, and they just got something to say. But they're literally nobodies in your world. They were never going to engage with you. They were never going to engage with your service. They were never going to engage with your product. They just got a big mouth, right? So you only listen to your clients, period, right? Everything else is bullshit. Until it's money in the bank, it's bullshit. Everybody who says, oh, well, I would have, bullshit, right? Either you do or you don't. There's no would, there's no could, there's no should. If you're not doing business with me, you're not my target, and I don't care what you think or what you have to say. And if you are, then you are my target. And I'm very open to anything that you might have to say, and I'm very open to adjusting, in any way possible, because you've proven yourself, right? So if you've proven yourself to be somebody who wants to benefit, from whatever it is that business owner is doing, then that business owner then has a responsibility to listen to what you have to say. If you're some nobody who's never done anything with them and never will, nobody cares what you have to say, because not for you, right? That business owner is not talking to you, right? So that's one of the things you got to wrap your head around as you're coming into business, is that the people who are not your clients do not matter to you, period. You're not talking to them. What you have is not for them, right? They're butting into a conversation that has nothing to do with them, plain and simple, right? So make sure that you're not pulled off target by trying to please everybody, which is a fool's errand. You'll never do it. Nobody ever has. Even like gods haven't, right? Not everybody is the same religion, right? So that means that even gods couldn't get everybody to back their play, right? So who are you? You think everybody's going to love what you're doing as a business owner? Think everybody's going to love your product? You think everybody's going to love your service? The only people that matter are your people. That's it when it comes to innovating your service and all of that type of stuff. So you don't listen to people on the outside who don't even know what you're doing. And that's how you become unbeatable, right? If you start playing someone else's game, you're going to lose because you're not them. You don't have their level of expertise in who they are, and you never will, because you'll never be them. You do it the way you do it. You don't let them influence what you're doing. You don't let them influence how you're doing it. You don't let them influence why you're doing it, right? And as long as like your ethics can align, then you can like maybe partner with them, right? Like we partner with companies that do similar things to what we do. No one does what we do, and we don't do what they do, right? But we partner with companies that do similar, right? Because we never try to be them. We don't, try to, take what looks cool in their business and apply it to ours. No, we're not them, right? For our clients, those things don't matter. And we hear that all the time. You know what I mean? Like, well, it might be a competitor. It might be somebody else in the same industry that we're partnered with, right? So we don't see them as a competitor. But our clients will come in and be like, oh, yeah, no, I saw them. But they are to this or they're to that. And for our client, there's just no appeal. And that's just the way it is, right? You know, it's very difficult to quantify why a Burberry client doesn't like Versace, right? But they don't, and that's that. Burberry clients are Burberry clients, Versace clients are Versace clients. That's that, right? Now, if Burberry tried to be Versace, they would fail. They can't. They're not Versace. They're Burberry, right? They're a completely different thing, and they run their business the way they've always run their business, and that's how they keep, their client base. And only their clients matter to them, opinion-wise, right? They only care about what their client base thinks about their products, and that's why they are where they are, right? So don't get lost in the sauce. Don't get lost in all the reviews. Don't get lost in the comments. Don't get lost in the foolishness, right? You do what you're going to do. You focus it on your target client. Their opinions are the only opinions that matter, and that's it. And you move forward from there. We good on that? Any questions on that? All right, I've been doing pretty good with these 30-minute things. We're at 27 minutes. So I'm gonna be done with this in 30 minutes. Again. Oh, of course it is. Yeah. Did I say something to make you think that it would be easy? If it was easy, everybody be doing it. And if it's too hard for you, then you're not gonna do it, and that's fine, right? But yeah, of course, it's difficult. Absolutely. That's what makes it worthwhile. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It might, yeah. I mean, it might sound easy because I've been doing it for 25 years. So it might sound easy when I talk about it. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's probably the hardest thing you'll ever do in your life. How about that? Right? Like, if it was easy to be successful, we would all be successful, right? We celebrate things that are rare and things that are difficult, which is why when people create campaigns to try and normalize those things, it doesn't make sense. We celebrate what's rare and we celebrate what's difficult, right? We celebrate beauty because not everyone's beautiful. We celebrate athleticism because not everyone's an athlete. And quite frankly, the majority of people aren't. That's why we celebrate it, right? It's rare. As humans, we focus, on scarcity and we celebrate rarity, right? Again, this is just evolutionary biology, right? That's just a matter of surviving. But that's how it works. We celebrate people who are like super fit because not everybody, most people aren't, right? The norm we don't celebrate. We don't celebrate the normal. We celebrate the elite, the most beautiful, the most fit, the smartest, the strongest. That's what we celebrate. So to pretend like, oh well, everybody is, that doesn't make sense. Right? So it's not easy. It's hard, and few people succeed, and then we celebrate those few people. That's just the way it is. It's the way it's always been. And I can't imagine it changing. Because why would you celebrate normalcy? Like, why would you? Who would you celebrate then? Right? The 80% in the middle. Like, what are we doing? So, so that's just the way it's always been. All right. Any other questions on that? We've hit 30 minutes. I think I'm gonna end it. It's been a snippet. I think we're good. No one's no one's got any serious questions here. Let's see. No, I think we're good. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me. And then if you need any assistance with going through a feasibility study or going through that process, you can take our free merger acquisitions assessment on our website. And then like one of our legal team, typically a lawyer answers those assessments. So one of our legal team will probably reach out to you after the assessment, no matter what the results of the assessment are, just to go over what it is you want. Sometimes I answer them too, so maybe you'll actually get me sometimes as well. But yeah, that's how that works. So you can jump on the website and you can go ahead and take that assessment and see what comes back. And if you are, a lot of questions came up more about bond ladder stuff, more about just kind of like following your own, dream stuff. So I think what I'll do is I'll do that as a separate kind of snippet live tomorrow and get into that. So we'll make that its own thing. All right, guys. Thanks for hanging out with me, and we'll see you next time.